They used my name, my trust, and my credit line to book a 10-day luxury trip across Europe. And I didn't find out until I received a fraud alert while standing in my kitchen, peeling carrots for a dinner they had already decided not to attend. That's how I learned my children had stolen from me, through a text message and a silence so loud it shook the floor under my feet. The charge was flagged by the bank not because it was large, but because it was uncharacteristic. A five-star boutique hotel in Florence, Italy, 2 rooms, paid in advance. I had never been to Italy, never even owned a passport. I hadn't left the country since 1978, when I'd gone to Vancouver with their father for our honeymoon. I stared at the notification on my phone as if it might explain itself, willing it to resolve into some kind of mistake. But there it was. At first, I hoped, it was a scam. Some cyber thief thousands of miles away using stolen data. But when I called the bank and asked for clarification, they read me a list of other charges. International airline tickets purchased from my linked account, restaurant reservations confirmed through my email, even photos linked to my Apple ID that I had never taken. My heart began to pound, not with confusion, but with the growing suspicion that I already knew who had done it. I just hadn't allowed myself to believe it yet. My daughter, Dana, had stopped by 2 weeks prior. She said she wanted to help me organize my digital life, whatever that meant. She had suggested linking my travel rewards account to an app she said was much easier to manage, something that would track points more efficiently. I hadn't questioned it. She'd sat at my kitchen table for over an hour with my phone and laptop, tapping quickly, her tone bright and breezy, pausing occasionally to ask for a password or to confirm an email. She even poured me a glass of wine and said, "It's nice to spend time together like this, Mom." That was the last time I saw her. My son, Evan, had called the next day and offered to review some of my card activity to make sure I wasn't being overcharged for my utilities, a gesture that had struck me as sweet, if slightly unnecessary, since I'd been managing my own bills for 50 years. He, too, had asked for a few bits of login information. "Just so I can help if anything happens," he said. I hadn't thought twice. These were my children, the same people I had fed, clothed, defended, forgiven, the same people I had driven to dance recitals and soccer matches, sat beside during hospital stays and courtroom hearings. I had given them everything. And now, I understood that they had taken what was left. I didn't call them immediately. I didn't yell or text or try to corner them into explanation. Instead, I waited. I needed to know how far they would go, how long they would keep lying. And most of all, I needed to understand who they had become when they thought I wasn't watching. 2 days later, Dana posted a photograph on social media, her standing beneath a cathedral in Barcelona, sunglasses perched on her head, holding a cappuccino in one hand and Evan's arm in the other. The caption read, "Sibling trip of a lifetime. Europe, here we come." There were hashtags: Florence, Hoch, Lisbon, why not? And dozens of comments from friends who gushed over how lucky they were, how incredible their journey looked. Not a single mention of me, not a thank you, not even a lie to disguise their method. Just pride. That was when something inside me shifted, not just from hurt to anger, but from sorrow to strategy. I went to the bank in person. I brought every document I could find: statements, identification, screenshots. I spoke calmly, clearly, and with a kind of coldness that I hadn't used in years. The woman behind the desk, a manager not much older than Dana, listened with wide eyes and leaned forward when I said, "I didn't lose my card. I gave it to my daughter to help me. I didn't think I had to protect myself from my own family. They froze the card, opened a fraud investigation, offered to escalate the matter to their internal legal team. I declined, for now. I had something else in mind. I contacted the travel agency that had handled their itinerary. I found the name through the confirmation email Dana had forwarded to my inbox without bothering to delete it. I told them there had been unauthorized charges. They asked for verification, which I provided. I explained the situation not with bitterness, but with precision. They asked if I wanted the trip cancelled. I said no. I wanted it rearranged. I asked them to downgrade every hotel booking to economy lodging with no refund offered, citing payment under dispute. I had them revoke their car rental in France and cancel all private tours and dinners. I requested that new confirmation emails be sent to their original inboxes, noting the changes without explanation. I told them I was the card holder, and I expected the changes to be executed with discretion. And they did. Then I went a step further. I filed a police report, not because I expected immediate action, but because I needed it on record. I wrote a detailed, unsent letter to Dana and Evan, outlining exactly what I knew, how I knew it, and what I intended to do if they did not contact me within 48 hours. I didn't threaten legal action. I didn't mention the fraud report. I simply told them, "You know what you did. You can either face me now or live with what comes next." They didn't respond. And so I began documenting every instance of misuse, every login from an unknown device, every payment rerouted through my accounts. And slowly, methodically, I began taking it all back. Not by deleting, but by reclaiming. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to ruin their vacation, one reservation at a time. Because they hadn't just stolen money. They had stolen the last part of me that believed they still saw me as a person, and not a purse. I did not sleep much that week. Not because I was restless in the way grief keeps you pacing in the dark, but because my mind had entered a state of absolute clarity, sharpened by betrayal and fueled by a calm, deliberate anger I had never quite experienced before. Every moment I was awake, I worked, not out of vengeance, but because I needed to act, to reassert some form of control over a reality that had been twisted in silence behind my back. When I wasn't on the phone with customer service departments, I was poring through online banking activity, opening folders, cross-checking logins, and documenting the breadcrumb trail my children had so carelessly left behind. It wasn't just a few tickets and a hotel. They had gone deep. They'd rerouted loyalty points, transferred airline miles, even attempted to add their own email addresses to my financial notifications. Dana had used her old college laptop, which had once been registered under my household Wi-Fi. Evan had created an auto-forward rule in my email that redirected any travel-related messages into an archive folder I rarely checked. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I wasn't paying attention. And perhaps I hadn't been. But I was now. I called the travel agency again, a boutique firm with an office in New York, and asked to speak with the supervisor who had handled the original booking. Her voice was polite, clipped, slightly defensive, until I explained that I was the card holder, the person whose name and financial history had been used without authorization. When I told her my own daughter had booked a luxury vacation using my accounts while assuring me she was merely helping me organize, the woman paused. There was a long silence, and then she said softly, "We see this more than you'd think." It hit me like a stone in the chest. More than you'd think. Parents being stolen from by their own children, not in back alleys or through reckless, violent means, but quietly, digitally, under the mask of help. Trust weaponized into theft. She agreed to continue making adjustments to the trip. All perks were stripped. The upgraded suite in Paris was changed to a 3-bed walk-up with no air conditioning and shared hallway bathrooms. The Michelin star reservation in Lisbon was cancelled. The prepaid couples massage in Florence? Rebooked under someone else's name, non-refundable. And still, neither Dana nor Evan reached out. I knew from their social media that they were in Barcelona on day 3. I watched with a kind of surreal detachment as they posted grinning selfies in front of La Sagrada Familia, sipping cocktails by the beach, tagging locations like they were travel bloggers, as if none of it had a cost, as if someone else hadn't paid the price. Because, of course, someone had. Me. So I continued. The airline was next. I contacted their carrier, explained that my card had been used fraudulently to purchase international flights. The bank had already issued a provisional credit while the investigation continued, which gave me leverage. The airline froze their return tickets pending confirmation. They wouldn't know until the moment they tried to check in, until they stood at the gate, bags packed, fatigue rising, ready to fly home, that the system would reject them. That would be the moment, I imagined, when they would realize. Mom knew. I began collecting statements for the fraud case. I organized every file in both digital and printed formats. I documented every dollar they had used, down to the ridiculous $42 they had spent on room service in Florence, just for espresso and morning fruits, as the receipt said. The entitlement of it nearly made me laugh. But there was still part of me, aching and human, that kept waiting for an apology, for some flicker of regret. I left my phone on at night. I checked my inbox too often. Some part of me still believed that maybe Dana would call and say, "I'm sorry, Mom. I messed up." That maybe Evan would send a message admitting he'd followed his sister's lead, that it got out of hand, that he hadn't thought it through. But all I received were more posts, more photographs, more curated illusions of 2 adult children living their best lives. On day 6 of their trip, they arrived in Florence. The captions changed. The smiles looked thinner, the photos fewer. Dana posted a story, blurry, angry text over a grainy hotel hallway, with the words, "This place is a joke. Never trust European hotel stars." There was no tag, just frustration, leaking through the cracks of their fantasy. And still, they didn't call. That night, I contacted their credit card providers, the ones I had co-signed years ago, back when they were in college and needed help building credit. I had always meant to remove myself as guarantor, but life got busy, and they had assured me they were responsible now. Of course, they were. I filed formal requests to revoke my co-signer status and freeze any accounts still linked to my identity. It would take a few days, but the wheels were in motion. And while I waited, I did something I hadn't done in months. I sat in my garden under the elm tree that my late husband had planted 30 years ago and simply breathed. Not with peace, not yet, but with certainty. Certainty that this was not revenge. This was consequence. Because you do not get to lie to someone who would have given you anything and then walk away as if the damage isn't real. You do not get to smile in front of cathedrals, paid for by hands you never even saw lift, and pretend you built that life on your own. You do not get to steal from your mother and expect her to bless the theft with silence. And now, as their trip limped into its final days, the silence between us was no longer mine to break. It was theirs to explain. The morning their return flight was due to depart, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, watching the sky turn from deep grey to the pale, reluctant blue that always marked the end of summer in this part of the country. The house was silent, But I was not alone in that silence. I was waiting. Not for a knock at the door or a letter, but for the inevitable. I knew what time their flight was scheduled to depart. I had checked the itinerary myself. After all, it had originally been sent to my email. It was just after 10 a.m. when my phone finally rang. Not a number I recognized, but I knew before I picked up that it was either Dana or Evan. And I also knew, with the calmness of someone who had already rehearsed every possible outcome, that they were no longer in control of the story they had written. That control they had handed to me. "Mum?" Dana's voice cracked slightly, half breathless, half already annoyed. "Something's wrong with the tickets." I said nothing at first. I wanted to hear how far she would go before reaching for the truth. "We're at the airport in Lisbon," she continued, clearly trying to sound composed, but I could hear the panic moving beneath her words like a current. "They're saying the reservation is frozen. We can't check in." "Did they tell you why?" I asked, carefully keeping my tone neutral, almost warm. "They said the payment method is in dispute or something," she said quickly, her voice rising now. "But it was booked weeks ago. Evan confirmed it, didn't you, Evan?" I could hear his muffled voice in the background, curt, defensive, saying something about calling the agency. "I see," I said, taking a sip of the cold coffee, letting the silence stretch long enough for discomfort to settle on their end of the line. "That must be very frustrating." There was a pause. Then, carefully, Dana asked, "Did you do something? With the bank?" I closed my eyes, and I chose my words not out of anger, but from an exact place between grief and resolution. "I didn't do anything, Dana," I said. "I simply responded to a charge I did not authorize, for a trip I did not plan, paid for with my accounts, using credentials you took from me without consent. I followed the law." There was a sharp intake of breath. Then nothing. "Mum?" she said finally, and the word had lost all its ease, all its entitled charm, now replaced by something that sounded for the first time like uncertainty. "We were going to tell you." "No, you weren't," I said, not unkindly, but with the clarity of someone who had waited too long to be lied to again. "You were going to return home, post a few final photos, and carry on as if it never happened. And if I'd said nothing, if the charges had gone unnoticed, you'd have smiled at me over dinner and asked about my roses, pretending nothing was wrong." "You don't understand." "Don't finish that sentence," I said, the warmth in my voice now gone, replaced by the same composure I had brought with me into the bank. "You don't get to justify betrayal with circumstance." There was movement on the line, perhaps Evan taking the phone, his voice lower, flatter. "So what? We're stranded now? Is that what you wanted? To punish us?" And there it was, the root of it all. Not apology, not remorse, but the assumption that I was acting out of spite, that my refusal to be used quietly must be vengeance. "No," I said. "I didn't strand you. You stranded yourselves the moment you decided my generosity could be converted into currency without permission. I would have helped you. I always helped you. But you chose to lie, to take, to hide. And actions have consequences, even for people we love." Evan swore under his breath. Dana muttered something about just fixing it and coming home to talk about it. But I had nothing else to offer them. I gave them a final piece of truth, and then I ended the call. "You don't need to talk to me at an airport. You need to talk to yourselves, because I'm done pretending this didn't happen." And with that, I hung up. That evening, I received a new charge notification. A pair of economy tickets purchased through a discount airline. Not on my card, of course. On Evan's. They were coming home after all. But they were coming home under their own weight. 3 days passed before I saw them again. I didn't reach out, didn't ask how the remainder of their trip had gone after the unravelling began. I didn't check for new photos. I didn't monitor their silence. I simply let it arrive, let it sit there between us like a wall they had built with their own hands. When Dana finally appeared at my door, her face drawn, eyes puffy from either exhaustion or crying, or both, I opened the door without speaking. She stood there for a long moment, unsure whether to come in or retreat. She was holding nothing. No apology wrapped in flowers, no envelope, no offering. Just her, and the shame she could no longer disguise. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice small, unfamiliar. "I'm not sure," I said. "Why don't you tell me why you're here?" "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know what we were thinking. We didn't mean to." "You meant to," I interrupted gently. "You just didn't think I'd fight back." She looked down, and for the first time in months, I saw her not as the daughter I had raised, not as the person who once fell asleep on my chest during thunderstorms, but as an adult who had made a choice. A bad one. A cruel one. But still, a choice. "Come in," I said finally. "We're not done." Because I was no longer someone who would let betrayal pass under the name of family. And I knew now that if I didn't demand the truth, not just for myself, but from them, then I wasn't protecting the love I had for them. I was protecting the lie that had poisoned it. She stepped inside like someone entering a place they no longer recognized, not because the furniture had changed, but because they no longer knew how to belong there. Dana walked slowly, almost tentatively, across the threshold of the same home where she had once run barefoot in the summers, where she had baked her first crooked birthday cake with my help, where she had cried in my arms the night her marriage dissolved. But now, her presence carried something new, the weight of choices she could no longer outrun. She sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes darting around the room, but never settling on me. I didn't rush to sit beside her. I didn't offer tea. This wasn't a social call. This was not a time for hospitality. It was a reckoning, and I had waited long enough for it. "I talked to Evan," she began, her voice already crumbling beneath the strain. He doesn't want to come over. He thinks it's better if we just let everything settle." I nodded once, without looking away from her. Of course he does. He's hoping time will do the apologizing for him. She flinched slightly at that. Not because it was cruel, it wasn't, but because it was true. And in that moment, I realized how little either of them had ever been made to sit with discomfort. I had been their cushion, their excuse, their quiet redeemer too many times. It stopped now. "I don't know what I can say," she added, almost whispering. "I mean, I know what we did. I know it was wrong. But it wasn't meant to hurt you. It was supposed to be temporary. We thought maybe after the trip we'd pay it off, or you wouldn't notice." "No," I said, my voice low but absolutely clear. "Don't insult both of us with half-truths. You didn't think I wouldn't notice? You thought I wouldn't matter." Dana's mouth opened slightly as if to protest, but no sound came. There it was again. That moment when a person realizes they're not misunderstood. They're seen. I continued, my tone steady. "You looked me in the eye, Dana. You sat in this very kitchen, poured me a glass of wine, and told me how lucky you were to have me. You smiled while you were already in the process of draining the accounts I spent a lifetime building. Do you know what that feels like?" She shook her head slowly, tears now welling in her eyes. It feels like I raised strangers, I said. It feels like everything I taught you about responsibility, about trust, about decency, it slipped right off your shoulders the moment it inconvenienced you. I didn't know how to ask, she choked out. No, I agreed. You didn't. Because you knew the answer might be no, and you've never learned how to live with no. The silence that followed wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It was full of the heaviness that comes only when words have finally struck their target. She sat there with her head bowed, her shoulders shaking, no longer as a daughter, but as someone who had finally come to the edge of her story and realized it had been written in ink she could no longer erase. When she finally spoke again, her voice was rough and trembling. What do you want from me? And I paused, because the answer wasn't simple. I don't want anything from you, I said carefully. What I want is something for you. I want you to take full responsibility, not this half-formed sorrow you carry when caught. I want you to face Evan, not hide behind his silence. I want you to return every dollar, not just in money, but in action. I want you to understand that I will never, not now, not ever, allow this to be forgotten in the name of family peace. She nodded, though her lips quivered. Because love, I added, leaning forward now, does not mean exemption. It means accountability, and you've gone too long without learning that. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket, eyes red and glassy. Can I fix this? I studied her for a long time, and in that moment I saw not the child I had once raised, but the woman she still had a chance to become, if she chose to. It would take more than tears, more than promises. It would take humility, and work, and time. You can start, I said softly. That's all any of us ever get. She stood slowly, unsure of whether to hug me or not, and I didn't offer. Not yet. There was a distance that needed to remain, a space between forgiveness and trust where truth has room to breathe. I'll call the bank, she said as she reached the door. And Evan. I'll start fixing what we broke. I nodded. Good. You'll send me proof, not words. Paper. And with that, she left. The house fell quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of betrayal. It was the silence of reckoning, of something shifting. Perhaps at last, something healing. Because this was not about revenge. This was about rebuilding boundaries where love had been mistaken for permission. And I had finally remembered that saying no to your children, even when it hurts, is sometimes the most loving thing you can do. The weeks that followed passed not with drama or sudden reversals, but with the slow, deliberate weight of consequence settling in. Dana kept her word, or, at the very least, began the process of trying. She forwarded me an official letter from the bank, confirming her voluntary acceptance of full financial liability for the charges made in my name. I read it carefully, 3 times, not because I didn't believe her, I didn't, but because I needed to see in writing what I could no longer accept through sentiment alone. It was the first thing she had ever taken responsibility for on paper. She also sent me a typed summary of the repayment plan she and Evan had agreed to, dividing the total between them, along with monthly deadlines and pledged transfer amounts. I responded not with praise or affection, but with a simple reply: received. I will acknowledge repayment only after each transfer posts. I wasn't being cruel. I was being precise. I had learned the difference. And though they were both quiet in those days, I could feel the unease rippling beneath every interaction. Dana sent a few awkward texts, checking in on how I was feeling. Evan didn't say anything directly, but made one quiet appearance at my door, unannounced. With a cashier's check in hand, and eyes that refused to meet mine. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't ask to come inside. He simply handed me the envelope and muttered, "That's my part for now." I took it, nodded, and closed the door without ceremony. It was not the kind of forgiveness people read about in novels. There was no weeping reunion, no sudden redemption arc. There was only the acknowledgement of harm and the long, dry road toward reparation. That's what real healing looks like sometimes. Not a wave of love, but a series of choices, repeated, measured, disciplined. And still, even as the mechanics of repayment slowly moved into motion, the wound they had left lingered, because what they had taken was not just my money, not even just my trust. It was a kind of internal compass I had lived by without question. The belief that the bond between a parent and child, however weathered, was grounded in something sacred, something you didn't exploit, something you didn't test just to see how far it could bend. I found myself reflecting more than I wanted to, in the garden, while sorting receipts, while lying in bed at night when the house had gone utterly still, about where I had gone wrong, about whether it was me who had taught them, however unintentionally, that my love was unconditional even when paired with silence, that I would forgive without confrontation, excuse without consequence, that I would absorb their selfishness like I once absorbed their tears, their scraped knees, their teenage mistakes. But I had not raised them to be cruel. I knew that much. They had become cruel because I had failed to show them where love ends and enabling begins. Now, I was showing them. Not with lectures or punishment, but by living differently. I joined a local community forum for older adults, many of whom had faced similar violations of trust by family. Not always with money, sometimes with manipulation, sometimes with simple absence. We didn't sit around and complain. We spoke plainly. We shared what we had learned. And when I told my story, not in detail, just the shape of it, a woman across from me took my hand afterward and said, "You remind me that we don't have to smile while being used." That moment stayed with me. I started writing more, not for anyone else, but for myself. I wrote down every step I'd taken since that first fraud alert appeared on my phone. The calls, the paperwork, the feelings I hadn't let show at the time. I wrote letters I never sent. I imagined a version of Dana who called the moment she made the first charge, who admitted what she needed, who allowed me the dignity of choosing to help. I imagined a version of Evan who came to me with honesty instead of hiding behind her plan. But I also wrote this truth over and over again. They did not ask because they did not think they had to. That sentence became the boundary line in my mind, the one that reminded me what I was protecting, not just from them, but for myself. By the end of that month, I had received 2 payments. Small, yes, but not symbolic, tangible, bank verified. Quiet steps back toward balance. I began to allow a little space in my heart again, not for reconciliation, not yet, but for the possibility that one day they might learn to love without taking, that they might learn the sacredness of repair. Until then, I lived my days simply, without apology. I made meals for one and savoured them. I walked the length of my street without glancing at my phone. I rearranged the living room, not for visitors, but for myself, because I wanted the sunlight to fall differently across the couch in the afternoons. And when I passed the photograph on the hallway wall, the one of all 3 of us taken years ago at the coast, laughing in a moment before any of this had happened, I didn't look away in pain. I simply said to myself, that woman in the picture believed she'd always be safe with them. And now, she was making sure she'd be safe with herself. By early spring, the chill that had lingered so stubbornly through February finally gave way to the softness of longer days and gentler winds. The magnolia tree in the front yard, which I had nearly trimmed back out of habit, began to bloom again, cautiously at first, then with full, unapologetic grace, as though it too had been holding its breath all winter and was now ready to take up space again. I stood under it one morning, the sky pale and open above, and felt something I hadn't in a long time: ease. It was not joy exactly, not celebration. I had no illusions that everything was fixed or that I had somehow won anything. But the sharpness of the betrayal had dulled to something less consuming, more instructive. Pain, when left to breathe without being repressed or romanticized, had a way of becoming structure. And in the slow rhythm of my days, I was building something new on the foundations of that structure. By then, 3 more payments had arrived from Dana and Evan, each one accompanied by the same automated notice, each one a reminder that they were, at the very least, following through on the external part of the repair. Internally, it was harder to know. We were civil, but distant. Dana sent occasional messages, a forwarded news article about gardening trends, a question about a family friend's new baby, once even a photograph of her standing outside the courthouse after attending a legal clinic on financial ethics, something she said she was volunteering for. I didn't respond with praise. I thanked her for the update. Nothing more. Because I had learned, painfully but fully, that premature forgiveness was not healing. It was a performance of peace, and I was no longer interested in pretending anything I hadn't earned. Still, it was strange, even now, to consider how easily it could have all remained hidden. Had I not checked that alert, had I not listened to my gut as it twisted in warning, had I trusted blindly instead of verifying, they might have gotten away with it. Returned from their European escape, smiling, sun-kissed, broke in their own careless way, but satisfied. They would have eaten dinner at my table again, laughed at something on TV, maybe even shown me pictures from their trip, all the while letting me believe nothing had changed. But it had changed, and not just because of what they did, but because I had allowed myself to fully understand that it was them who did it. It's one thing to suffer loss or deceit from strangers, but when the blow comes from the people you raised, from the ones who learned how to hold a spoon in your kitchen and cried against your chest when they were too tired to speak, that kind of pain rewrites your map of the world. It takes every assumed truth about love and loyalty and rearranges it, quietly, brutally. And then it asks you to live with the new shape. That's what I was doing now. Living with the new shape. Not resisting it. Not trying to stretch it back into what it once was. But acknowledging it. Making room for it. I found a new kind of steadiness in routine. In the way the sun shifted across the porch by mid-morning. In how my garden responded to the extra handful of compost I began adding weekly. In the letters I exchanged with a woman named Joy from the community group, who had gone through something eerily similar with her own son. Only in her case, the damage had never been confronted. She wrote once, "The difference between you and me is that you said no." I whispered it. You screamed it. That line stayed with me. I hadn't screamed in the literal sense, not once. But I had made my refusal so clear, so unwavering, that it had functioned like a scream in their lives. A disruption, a command to stop, a reassertion of the boundaries they had crossed without permission. And in doing so, I had not only protected myself, I had given them, if they were willing, a line they could not cross again. And sometimes, boundaries were the most loving thing a parent could offer. One evening, just before dinner, my doorbell rang. Dana stood there again, this time with no makeup, hair pulled back, a manila folder in her hand. She didn't ask to come in. She didn't look like she expected comfort. "I wanted to show you this," she said. "It's a record of every transaction, what we used, what we're paying back. I thought maybe you'd want the full picture." I took the folder. She didn't ask for validation, which meant she might finally be learning. "There's also a letter in there," she added. "From me. Not typed, handwritten. I didn't want to email it. I didn't want you to think this was for convenience." I nodded. "Thank you." She lingered for a moment, then turned to leave, her steps quieter than when she arrived. She had come not to plead, but to present. That was new. That night, I opened the folder. Her handwriting, unmistakably hers, the same rounded loops from her childhood birthday cards, filled 2 pages. She didn't beg. She didn't excuse. She wrote, "You may never trust us again the way you used to. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking that you see we're trying to become people who understand what you gave us and what we risked by thinking we were entitled to more." I read it 3 times. Then I folded it carefully, placed it in a drawer not far from the bank statements, and sat down with a sense I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. Not closure, not forgiveness, but movement. Forward. Slow, honest, and finally, real. The shift in our dynamic, that slow but undeniable movement from injury toward acknowledgement, began to unfold not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in the most mundane places. The short notes tucked inside envelopes, the careful tone of a message, the moments when Dana or Evan chose to remain quiet instead of defending the indefensible. These were not signs of redemption, at least not yet, but they were proof of something more valuable at this stage of my life, that they had begun to recognize I was not simply the background of their lives, not a fixture, not a fallback, but a person who had limits, who had been wounded, and who had every right to say, that was enough. I did not invite them back into my daily routines. I did not return to holiday group texts or offer to babysit friends' children the way I used to when Dana was overwhelmed and Evan was too proud to ask for help, but happy to accept it when it was offered freely. Instead, I focused inward, not out of bitterness, but because I needed to remember how to live a life that didn't orbit around fixing the consequences of other people's choices. I finally signed up for the art class I had postponed for years. On Thursday mornings, I drove to the community centre, walked into a sunlit room that smelled faintly of linseed oil and chalk dust, and spent 2 hours among women and men whose lives had fractured in different places: loss, divorce, illness, disappointment, and who, like me, had decided to build something with their hands as a way of steadying their hearts. My brushstrokes were unsteady at first, and I never quite got proportions right, but I found joy in the doing. I painted trees mostly, quiet trees, alone in fields, not because I felt lonely, but because they looked like how I felt, still standing, roots deep, unbothered by the seasons. The payments continued, always on time, always accompanied by silent electronic confirmations. It was the kind of consistency that spoke louder than apologies ever could. And while I had not explicitly forgiven them, I found that my anger no longer burned. It had settled into something more useful, a sense of distance that allowed me to see them as they were, not as I had once needed them to be. One Saturday morning, Evan called. The screen lit up with his name, and I considered, just for a moment, letting it ring out. But I answered. His voice was different this time, slower, hesitant. "Hi, Mum. I was wondering if I could stop by. Not for long. I just wanted to talk in person." I paused before responding. "If you're coming to explain or justify, it's not necessary. But if you're coming to listen, you're welcome." There was a silence then. "To listen, I promise." He arrived with no expectations, no prepared speech, no envelope in hand. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, where I had once peeled carrots, while learning that both of my children had emptied my accounts behind my back. This time he looked older, not in years, but in posture, in the weight behind his eyes. "I was selfish," he said, after a long pause. "I didn't think about what it would do to you. I thought, you'd be okay. You always are." "That's the problem," I replied gently. "You thought being okay meant I didn't feel it?" He nodded. We sat in that silence, not strained, not cold, just quiet, as if the absence of denial, at long last, had allowed for some oxygen to return to the room. "I've started seeing someone," he said finally. "She asked what kind of family I came from, and I didn't know how to answer." I looked at him steadily. "That's because you haven't decided what kind of man you want to become." He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just nodded again, slowly. When he left, he turned at the door and said, "I know you may never fully forgive me, but I needed to know if you still see me as your son." I stood in the doorway, light behind me, arms crossed loosely, and for the first time in a long time, I answered without resentment, "You will always be my son, but it's up to you whether you're someone I trust again." He didn't look crushed by that. If anything, he looked grateful. And after he left, I sat in my garden, the air turning with that cool breath spring gives before summer, and I felt the smallest shift inside me. Not healing, not completely, but space. Space for the possibility that love, if treated properly, might one day become safe again. But only because I had drawn a line, and this time, I had not erased it for anyone. May arrived with a gentleness I hadn't expected. After the storm of those earlier months, the betrayal, the confrontation, the hollow quiet that followed, I had almost forgotten what ordinary days felt like. But there they were again, the porch light flicking on without effort, the hum of bees in the lavender, the morning paper arriving right on time, with nothing in it about my children, my bank accounts, or my name spoken in rooms without my permission. It was life, not as it had been before, but life as it could be after, not restored, but revised. Dana came by one Sunday morning. She didn't ask if I was busy. She brought nothing in her hands except herself, which in its own way was better than a bouquet or apology wrapped in obligation. She stood at the gate for a moment before pushing it open, her movements small and careful, like someone entering a space they feared they'd only been temporarily permitted to re-enter. "I brought coffee," she said softly, lifting a paper tray with 2 cups. I didn't smile, but I opened the screen door and stepped aside. We sat on the porch, not close, not touching, but side by side in the chairs that had once held our conversations for years, from her teenage complaints about geometry to the nights she cried over the man who left her and never came back. It was strange how grief and intimacy could share the same seat. "I got a second job," she said after a few minutes of silence. "Freelance work. It's not much, but it's enough to keep up with the repayments and maybe still breathe a little." I nodded, not in approval, not in judgment, just to let her know I heard her. She continued, her voice steadier now. "I think part of me thought you'd never actually push back. That you'd be hurt, yes, but that, somehow, you'd forgive us just because we're your children." She stared out at the garden, where the roses were beginning to blush pink again after their winter dormancy. "I didn't know," she said quietly, "how wrong that belief was." I raised you to believe you were loved, I replied. Not that you were exempt from consequence. She nodded, a small, pained smile flickering at the edge of her mouth. I confused the two, and I think maybe you did too, for a long time. That struck something in me, not because it was unfair, but because it was, in part, true. I had spent so many years absorbing their failures, covering for their shortcomings, smoothing over what could have been sharp lessons, all in the name of love. I had believed I was protecting them, but in some ways, I was only protecting them from learning what it meant to carry weight. Dana reached into her pocket and unfolded a wrinkled piece of paper, a photocopy of a form with her signature at the bottom. This is the final transfer form from the card company. They've closed the balance under my name alone. You're no longer liable. Officially. I took the paper and folded it once, slowly, before placing it in the small wooden box by the door where I kept keys, notes, and things that mattered. I didn't say thank you. She hadn't done me a favor. She had simply begun to clean up the wreckage of her own choices. I'm not asking to be forgiven, she said after a moment, her voice quiet but direct. I'm asking to be seen beyond what I did. That gave me pause, not because it was unreasonable, but because it was vulnerable. Because in it, I saw not a manipulative adult who had stolen from me, but the fractured echo of the daughter I once carried in my arms, who had always struggled to speak plainly about what she needed. And perhaps now she was trying to. You will be seen, I said carefully, but not as the daughter who is owed anything, as the woman who earns her way back in, one step at a time. She nodded, accepting it not as punishment, but as instruction. When she left, there was no hug, no tight smile, just a small wave from the sidewalk, and a silence I could sit with comfortably. Not because the wound was gone, but because it was no longer actively bleeding. That evening, I sat with the small folder of receipts, confirmations, and statements that marked the trail of accountability. I didn't revisit them to stoke my anger. I revisited them to remind myself of the cost of ignoring my own boundaries. The truth was, I had allowed too much for too long. Not out of weakness, but out of fear. Fear that holding them accountable would mean losing them entirely. But the irony, of course, was that I had already lost them in the most painful way possible. Not to death, but to entitlement. Not to distance, but to dishonesty. And now, in this new phase, where they returned not with excuses, but with updates, not with charm, but with responsibility, I began to understand something more clearly than I ever had before. It wasn't too late to rebuild something honest, but it would never look like it did before, because the old version of us had been too fragile, too dependent on my silence and their comfort. And this new version, if it was going to exist at all, would have to be founded on truth, the kind that neither flatters nor shelters, but stands, just like I had. And just like I would continue to do, for as long as I had breath in my body. Summer arrived with a kind of steady warmth that seemed, this year, more earned than expected. The light lingered later each evening, stretching across the lawn and into the house with that golden softness that makes even old furniture seem new again. There was no chaos now, no phone calls laced with tension, no nights spent combing through account statements or clicking through security settings. Life had quieted, not in the way that suggests nothing is happening, but in the way that proves everything that needed to be said had been spoken, and everything that needed to be broken had already shattered. What remained was something cleaner, something truer. The payments had continued without fail. By June, nearly 2/3 of the debt had been repaid, not in one dramatic sweep, but piece by piece, like someone repairing a damaged wall by hand, brick by brick, with no shortcuts. I never commented on them. I never congratulated or encouraged. That wasn't the point. What they were doing now wasn't generous. It was necessary. And I had stopped confusing those two things. Dana came by sometimes. Not every week, but often enough. Each visit was short, quiet, and respectful. She didn't ask to stay for meals. She didn't hover. Once, she brought a book, one we had both read years ago, and left it on the porch swing with a note. Thought of this, and thought of us. I didn't respond. I simply placed it on the shelf in the hallway, not out of sentimentality, but because it belonged there. Because memory, even painful memory, had its place. Evan had called twice, both times brief, still guarded. But I sensed something softening around the edges. He hadn't visited again, not yet. But he had, for the first time, sent a message with no pretext, no attached document or question. Hope your garden's doing well. I know summer's your favourite. I didn't reply right away, but 3 days later, I sent him a photo of the magnolia tree, its blooms full, wild, unapologetically large, with a single caption, "Still standing." That was all. And it was enough. In that time, I began returning more fully to myself. I no longer watched the door with anticipation or dread. I no longer felt the weight of waiting. I took longer walks in the evening, through the neighborhood that had watched all of this unfold in silence. And I noticed how people looked at me differently, not with pity, and certainly not with judgment, with something closer to quiet respect, a kind of recognition. As if I had said aloud what many others only whispered behind closed doors, that family is not license, and love is not immunity. At the local community center, I began leading a monthly discussion group for older adults, not about finances or fraud, but about boundaries, a topic that drew in more people than I ever expected. There, women and men who had lived through so many eras of silence found language for the things they'd endured. Children who drained their accounts, partners who dismissed their voices, relatives who wrapped abuse in the guise of care. And each time we gathered, each time someone dared to say, "I let them take too much before I said no," the room grew a little stronger. One woman, Miriam, said to me after a session, "I thought my choices made me weak, but you made me realize they just made me tired, and tired people can still change." Those words echoed in me for days, because that had been the truth of it all along. I hadn't fought because I was fierce. I had fought because I was tired. Tired of being taken for granted. Tired of being quiet. Tired of handing over pieces of myself in the name of a peace that wasn't even real. And now, I had found something steadier. Not the kind of peace that came from everyone doing what I wanted, but the kind that came from knowing I had finally done right by myself. By July, the final repayments were near. Dana sent me a message with the subject line, "Almost there," and attached, a spreadsheet, neatly organized, color-coded, itemized, with the final 3 payments marked clearly. She wrote beneath it, "I know this doesn't undo what we did, but it's the beginning of becoming someone better. I hope you see that. I hope you let me show you that. Over time." I sat with that message for an hour before replying. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what I needed to say. And I wanted to say it only once, and say it right. I replied, "Dana, you do not owe me perfection. You owe me consistency. And this is a start. Keep walking the path. I'll be here. But I won't walk it for you." And for the first time, she didn't push back. She simply replied, "Understood." That night, I sat on the back porch, the sky turning lavender and soft gold, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and cut grass. I watched the fireflies blink slowly over the lawn, and I breathed, not as someone who had won a battle, not as someone who had proven a point, but as someone who had made it through the wreckage of what had once felt like unforgivable betrayal, and who now lived with open eyes, a clear heart, and a home that, for the first time in years, truly felt mine again. Not because I had built it from scratch, but because I had reclaimed every inch of it, every corner, every memory, and most importantly, every inch of myself. The final payment arrived on the first day of August, quiet, unannounced, and clean. It showed up in my bank statement with the same sterile format as the others: a sum, a timestamp, a confirmation number. But I stared at it for several minutes, not because it was remarkable on its own, but because of everything it represented. Not just dollars returned, but a line drawn and respected from beginning to end. I didn't call Dana. I didn't email Evan. I didn't say thank you. That payment was not a gift. It was a reckoning. A full circle that had taken months of silence, confrontation, and slow, painful clarity to reach. They had finally paid back every cent they had stolen from me. But more than that, they had learned, whether they realized it or not, that I was no longer the version of myself who would accept love that arrived wearing the mask of entitlement. That weekend, I took the entire file, the statements, the printouts, the letters, the screenshots, and placed it in a thick manila envelope. I sealed it, not because I intended to throw it away, but because I needed it to become a closed chapter. I didn't file it under financial. I filed it under boundaries. And I placed it in the back of the closet, not out of shame, but because some truths, once processed, no longer need to live in the front drawer. I spent that evening in the garden, not pruning or watering, but simply sitting, watching the way the late sun filtered through the high branches, listening to the soft shuffle of leaves, breathing without expectation. For so long, every breath had been accompanied by the noise of betrayal, the ache of being dismissed, the constant pull of unfinished forgiveness. Now, there was only quiet. And in that quiet, something shifted in me. A week later, Dana called and asked if I'd consider joining her for lunch. Not at her house, and not at mine, but at a small cafe halfway between us. She emphasized gently that there was no agenda, no big ask, just lunch. I agreed. We met outside under a green awning on a mild, overcast day. She arrived a little early, and I saw her before she saw me. Sitting at the table, phone face down, hands clasped, as if trying to steady herself. She had grown thinner, or maybe it was that she had simply shed some of the frantic energy that had once cloaked her like armor. She looked like someone who had been forced to sit with herself. When she saw me, she smiled. Not widely, not performatively. Just enough to say I'm here, if you'll let me be. The conversation was simple at first, polite, adult, the kind of neutral ground that feels necessary when the terrain is still being redrawn. We talked about the weather, the price of gas, the cafe's lemon cake. Only after the coffee had arrived did she speak directly. "I'm not here to ask you to forget anything," she said. "And I know you'll never fully trust us again in the same way." "I get that." I said nothing. I let her continue. "But I hope," she went on, voice quieter now, "that you'll let me keep trying to show up differently." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw someone who was not perfect, not reformed, not entirely healed. But I saw someone who was finally, mercifully, awake. Awake to what she had done. Awake to who I was. Awake to the reality that love does not excuse abuse, and blood does not sanctify betrayal. And in that moment, I understood that while I had never needed her to be perfect, I had always needed her to tell the truth. And she was doing that now, one word at a time. "I don't need you to earn your way back into my life," I said carefully. "But I do need you to walk in, knowing what it costs to be here." She nodded. "I do." We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We finished our coffee, split a piece of lemon cake, and walked separately to our cars. It wasn't reconciliation in the traditional sense. It was something sturdier, a quiet understanding that the road ahead was narrow but real. That evening, Evan called. For the first time, he didn't sound defensive or withdrawn. "Dana told me about lunch," he said. "I'm glad you went." "So am I." "I know I have further to go," he added. "I know I was worse about it, about everything, but I'm not finished trying. I didn't say I forgive you. I didn't say it's okay. I said, then keep trying." And I meant it, because the version of me that had once carried every wound without naming it, who had swallowed every insult in the name of family, who had believed that silence was strength, she was gone. In her place stood someone unshaken, someone older, yes, but also wiser, clearer, and no longer afraid to choose herself. I had not lost my children, not completely, but I had lost the illusion that they would always choose me with the same care I had chosen them. And in that space, in that hard, necessary space, I had found myself again, fully, finally, unapologetically. And that, in the end, was the true victory. Not that they paid me back, but that I stopped letting them take.